what I wanted to ask you, so I read your Times article, which I loved,
Thanks.
and I was wondering two things. Did that prompt the book, or had you
Mhm.
already had the book in mind?
Mm-mm. No, I wasn't planning on writing about this. I didn't want to write about this. I didn't think I was capable of writing about this. I'm still not sure I'm capable of writing about this. But yeah, it started with the school shooting in Parkland now a year and a half ago almost. Um, and I was just, because I live in Connecticut,
Yeah.
I've been paying a lot of attention to school shootings since then. My kids were, in elementary school when that happened, 5, 6 miles away from my house. And so I was just increasingly over the years agitating for gun control
Right.
and railing against the NRA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then when Parkland happened, I just made the obvious point, but nobody's acknowledging in any meaningful way that the shooters are almost always boys or young men.
Right.
And so the question I just asked the question, why is that the case? And then, so I was just writing that on Twitter and I wrote a Twitter thread about it. And then the Times contacted me and was like, do you want to write an op-ed about it? And I was like, ugh, I don't know that I can.
You're like, now I'm the spokesman
Well,
for.
that was like a concern for me. I was like, I'm not capable.
You
I'm
think
not educated on sociology or gender or history or
you're like
anything,
anything,
anything, anything.
but
And
you
so I was,
are a male and you have a son, so that
that those two things are my only qualifications. And
right.
I sort of felt like, well, maybe that's enough
Yeah.
as a springboard.
Yeah.
So then a publisher approached me, Algonquin Books, and they said, do you want to write a book? I was like, I don't know that I can. I don't know that I should. And I don't know that I want to be a spokesperson for this issue, both because I don't feel qualified and also because I just feel like I'm always so wary when celebrities, and believe me, I say that with a lowercase c about myself,
Sorry.
start advocating for shit, you know? It just, it's not that I doubt their earnestness, but earnestness makes me cringe, particularly when it comes from celebrities.
I mean, it doesn't sound like you were doing it for any kind of popularity. Like, meaning like it was a real issue, no one was talking about it, so it's like, why not? Like, I am starting a nonprofit, I don't have that experience, but I'm a mom of 2 boys.
Right.
These programs don't exist, so someone's gotta do it, like.
Yeah, absolutely. But when you're as self-loathing as I am, you go, oh, people would think this is some sort of fame grab, money grab, as if writing about gender is going to be some big money grab.
I was
But
gonna say, I bet you're not gonna make that much money off of it. Now, I have a question about race and gender. So, I similarly, when I was thinking about starting Build Up Boys, was thinking about how scary it was to send my kindergartner to school, public school, and worry about shootings and drills. And also, when I was pregnant and found out I was having a boy, I'm like, how do I make it so that he doesn't become a school shooter or he doesn't become a rapist? Like, the rape culture on college campus is insane. So it's like, what were those mothers or parents doing differently or not differently? They didn't think they had a problem. And so I just was thinking it has to start so much earlier. This is about mental health. It's about giving access to emotional vocabulary. It's teaching boys how to self-regulate. It's changing the conversation. But when I was thinking about the school shootings in particular, I'm like, they're all pretty much boys,
Mhm.
And so, like, what, and given you're a white man, I just feel like the white boy problem is different. Like, there were 2 kids on our block. We lived in a very diverse neighborhood, and they, or 2 black boys, were friendly with them, and they were like running to our yard, and they had like Nerf guns on, and I was like, they could get shot. Like, I don't have to worry about my sons being shot. Like, they could be shot. So I just feel like there's so many, masculinity is an issue across all cultures, but there are different like issues popping up. And I'm just wondering if when you wrote the op-ed at first, you were thinking
Oh
about,
yeah.
yeah,
I was very conscious in the beginning. and to this day about race. And I'm very careful in the book to say, I'm really talking to white people here. Because I can only talk to white people. I don't have the experience. And I talk a lot about the way race influences our ideas of, our sort of traditional ideas of American masculinity in the white population. I don't know enough to speak at all. I mean, I'm already out on a limb. And so I'm pretty careful to address this book to my son. It's a letter to my son.
It's a letter to your son, which I love.
And I talk a lot about race in the way American masculinity is inevitably tied up with white supremacy. I try to avoid terms like patriarchy and white supremacy, but they're impossible. They're impossible to avoid. I avoid them as much as possible because they can be so alienating to the exact people I'm trying to reach.
Right. So interesting you say that, because we're working with this guy who tries to address white men and how they perpetuate white supremacy or fight it. And so when we were talking about our curriculum, I said to my husband, I was like, well, what if we address that part of it? And he's just like, I don't think I would join a group for someone telling me I'm a white supremacist and I have a problem. Right. And that's my husband who goes to therapy and is very emotionally connected, or at least curious about it, and tries.
He's obviously a white supremacist.
Totally. It's a Jewish Nazi. Like, this is such a sensitive topic and no one wants to feel on the defensive like they're doing something wrong. So how do you get people to enter the conversation without making people defensive?
I had a choice to make, which is I could either sort of tap dance around it or just talk about it. And I chose to talk about it.
Did you talk about it in terms of, do you feel like you've had a certain privilege and you've acknowledged that, and have you raised your son with a certain privilege? Like, how did that act out in your raising your son, or how you were raised?
No, I certainly never thought I had any kind of privilege. I came from a fairly modest background. I grew up in a lesbian household in the 80s. And it never occurred to me that I had any kind of privilege whatsoever. Right. But of course I did.
Right.
But it took me until very recently to understand that and to look at it. And, my son is growing up in very different circumstances. We have more money. My wife and I are his biological parents. We've been together. It's a stable household. I was the child of divorce and a very unstable household. But I think when you're young, in particular, and you only know one set of life circumstances, you can understand intellectually that not everybody has your good fortune and privileges, but you only know this experience. It's very hard to wrap your arms around anybody living differently. And I think that was probably true for both of my kids, and maybe still be true. My son is now off in college, and I think he's seeing a little bit more of the world. My daughter's still in high school and still pretty sheltered. And we try to educate them to the best of our ability. But I think understanding privilege is something that, in my experience anyway, has to be lived in. You have to walk around in this world for years before you really come to grips with it. And I don't know that you ever really do, because by nature, people are so myopic. We only see such short distances that you really, really have to primarily listen to other people's lived experiences.
Yeah.
And not only listen, not only hear them, but believe them, which is a big step for a lot of people. Let's say young Black men complaining about getting harassed by the police. But if you've never lived in that and you've never experienced that, it might be hard to contrast your own experiences with that and feel it in any kind of deep way.
Because
So
that's
you
not
have to
your
believe.
experience, right? You haven't seen it. You don't deal with
No.
it. Like, you don't deal going to a public pool and not getting in trouble because you're white,
Right.
but the black kids get in trouble for doing the same exact things. Like, this is not your experience.
Right. I'm also very wary of white guilt. I think there can be a beating of the breast that isn't particularly constructive either.
Have you read Peggy Orenstein's book, Boys and Sex, yet?
Yeah.
So, the feminist fuckboy, and this
Mm-hmm.
idea of being able to talk the talk, and you should care about consent, and you shouldn't be racist, and there's all this stuff around, oh, okay, so I have white fragility, so that means I need to be this way, or being an ally is this. And so sometimes people can construct these kind of personas or ways of talking, and it's not authentic to them, and their behavior is very different, right? So
Yeah.
is that kind of what you're talking about?
It is what I'm talking about, and I think that is absolutely true. But I don't think it's always nefarious, meaning I don't think
Right.
feminist fuckboys are constructing personas to undermine feminism. I think they believe for themselves, but don't see their own misbehavior because they consider themselves allies. I mean, I feel like this happens all the time. But I don't think it's necessarily nefarious. In fact, I would say most of the time it probably
It's not.
isn't. It's
Right.
just blinders people have on, myself
Right.
included.
Right.
I think it's important for everybody, male and female, to understand that we have these blind spots. We all have them. They just tend to be more dangerous when men have them
Right.
because we have more power.
Do you think that there's a difference between privilege and entitlement?
Yeah. Privilege is kind of an inheritance that you're given. Entitlement is money that you think you're owed.
Or even bodies, right? Like,
Well, yeah, I was just extending the metaphor probably that.
You're like, follow me here. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that in terms of privilege and entitlement and issues of consent, and how all of that stuff to me has to happen so early.
Mhm.
And that to some extent, I wonder if not it's too late, because I don't think anything's too late. As you said, you've just started to understand your blind spots as an older person with older kids. And that's great, because it means you're always questioning and looking at yourself and looking at the world, and the world conversation's changing. I grew up in the 80s too, and I feel like it wasn't an option for me. Like, there was maybe one gay kid in theater, but like, I couldn't date a girl. Like, it was not, I didn't know, like, I could have, but like, it was not what it is today, where people, like, when I was counseling 8th grade girls, like 3 of them were bisexual, 1 of them was trans, like there wasn't that same kind of spectrum flexibility conversation going on in the 80s.
Right.
And I think that's changed. And so when conversations change, then we have to kind of change with the conversation.
I would say I've noticed the conversation changing even from the time I was asked to write the book. I mean, because I felt like at that time the conversation hadn't even started. This is a year and a half ago.
Right.
And I feel like now, a year and a half later, it absolutely has. But I see far more articles, op-eds, editorials about this subject. I see, and I have these conversations. Obviously, I've stepped into this world. But when I first started just researching this, most of the stuff that I was finding was pretty academic. Literally like a year and a half ago. I'm specifically talking about like masculinity, issues about masculinity. But I feel like that is changing and changing rapidly. I don't know that that change will take hold. I don't know that it will really dig into the culture in a meaningful way. I hope so. But it's a slow process. And a lot of the reason it's so slow, I think, is because like the nature of femininity, the traditional nature of femininity, I'm talking about the sort of social nature, I'm not talking about biological nature. The social nature of femininity allows self-examination and introspection in a way that the social nature of traditional masculinity does not.
Right. I like you saying that there was not the same permission given.
Right.
to go into that conversation, to even be intimate with other men, to talk about these issues, to define what masculinity is on your own, that there isn't just one version of it.
Right. And so the ramp up to the conversation is probably harder than the conversation itself.
Right. Do you think some of it has to do with misogyny? Meaning that if there's more of a spectrum, so for example, my first grader now, he likes to wear ponytails and he likes to wear nail polish. And when he was little, he wore a Frozen dress, and I just kind of let him do whatever he wanted. And then he also wanted a Stormtrooper toothbrush. I'm like, that is gender fluidity. But he started being made fun of in the twos, like, you're a girl, like as if it were bad to be a girl. And then I think of that Madonna song. Do you know it? Like, wouldn't you want to know what it's like to be a girl? There's like a British opening that's like, girls can wear pants and cut their hair short, but for boys,
I don't know that.
or something like that. Because you think it's degrading to be a girl. And I often wonder if like that's also it, that anything softer or considered emotional has to do with maybe hating women.
The short answer to that, I think, is yes.
Okay.
But I think the longer answer is much more nuanced than that.
Right.
And I think the longer answer, if I can answer in a short way, and I don't know that I can, is that for a long time, we used to understand gender roles in a very binary way.
Right.
Women did this work, men did this work.
Right.
Then men's roles started to expand gradually. And a lot of men who were over on this side felt like, oh shit, if women are moving into my domain, where does that leave me? And there's very tangible reasons for men to have that anxiety that aren't just about, I hate women. For a certain slice of the male population, they started feeling more and more crowded into this narrower and narrower slice of what masculinity is. Right. Because they felt like we need to sort of fight against encroaching femininity. Now, you can say, well, why did they feel like they needed to fight against encroaching femininity? And the easy answer, and in some cases the true answer, is misogyny. But I think it cuts deeper than that. Men's understanding of who we are as men started to change. And that's not necessarily because we hate women.
No, I totally agree.
We need to understand, because all people need to understand who they are in the world.
Right.
And a lot of men felt like, for I think, deeply historical reasons, that they couldn't allow themselves to occupy the same domain as women.
Right. So my partner, Paul ran a father's group and I ran a mother's group. And we asked them, what do you think of men? Like, when you think of adjectives, what comes up? And what do you think of your men? And then Paul asked, what do you think your women would say about you? And but the men were much more positive in their adjectives of what they thought of men than the women were. And the women were really negative. And that is also a problem. Like, and I don't know if that comes from, I'm wondering your opinion. And again, this is going to take a lot of unearthing to understand the source. But if women felt dominated and hated and controlled, is there this kind of reverse of, now I want to have power over you, and by doing that, I'm putting you down. I'm disempowering you.
Oh, yeah. I can speak about it from a very personal place, because as I said, I grew up in a lesbian household, and my mom and dad divorced, as I said, when I was quite young. And my mom and her partner were very open about their disdain for men. And so I grew up really internalizing that message. That men are, the phrase that was always in my house was male chauvinist pigs.
Oh my God, that is very 80s.
Yeah. Classic.
Classic, yes.
So I grew up with that and really internalizing that and really being nervous about my own behavior and sort of hyper aware of my own masculinity or questions about my own masculinity. But I do think anecdotally, as an adult, I hear women shitting on men way more than I ever hear men shitting on women.
I agree. That's what I've come to see. Like, it's a very big issue. And I'm a feminist. I love women. I'm a woman's woman. I mean, I counseled 8th grade girls to help self-esteem. Like, I think women need the programs like Girls in STEM. Like, there are all of these amazing development programs for girls, and that's great. I just feel like this hatred of boys and men is contributing to whatever's happening.
I think there's two competing things in big ideas in the culture. One is that men are analytical, intelligent, assertive, powerful, commanding. I think that idea still exists.
Yeah.
There's also a competing narrative that men are inept, foolish, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In the personal sphere, family, community sometimes, interpersonal relationships, that's where I feel like we experience the idea that men are inept, bumbling fools more commonly.
Right. I agree with that.
But those probably have some truth to them. And it's because of the way men were raised and continue to be raised to a certain extent. I think we are bumbling a lot of times in interpersonal relationships. We are inept when it comes to nurturing sometimes, empathy. I mean, I'm inept when it comes to that stuff a lot of times. These things don't come easily to me. I've had to really work on that stuff. Then again, I mean, leadership and authority doesn't come easily to me either. Nothing comes easily to me.
You're very funny. So that's good.
Yeah, that's something.
That is a magic power. But I agree. I was thinking when we were putting together the curriculum and how even Legos for the girls, they'll have like an animal Lego for the girl to take care of, but the boys don't have an animal to take care of. Like, when are boys taught that we have to take care of each other and we have to nurture? And then also, when are they taught that intimacy doesn't have to be stigmatized? Like, girls can massage each other's backs and braid their hair. And if boys were to have that, continue to have that physical kind of intimacy, would that mean you're gay? And it's like, what's wrong with being gay? And like, there's also that fear. But until I think boys feel free to just have their own range of emotions and know that it is their responsibility, like, be a father, they're going to have to nurture a child, like, to be a partner to a man or a woman, that involves nurturing, like, to be taught these things that just aren't taught, and to somehow destigmatize that kind of intimacy between men. Like, I even notice my husband, it's really hard to be a parent and also be a creative person and also be a partner. Like, it's hard to do all of that. I have group texts with women going all the time, being like, this sucks, this sucks. And he doesn't have any of that. And even his best friends, they'll like talk about technology before they'll be like, oh my God, have you had sex? Like, or, do you think your marriage is going to last through this? Like, they just don't have those conversations. And
Right.
so where is the support emotionally?
There isn't. It doesn't exist.
So like, what have you done anything to try to be more connected to men? Like, has this...
Yeah, I've made an effort, like literally since I started writing the book. So like examine my own relationships with other men and address exactly what you're talking about, the lack of intimacy between men. Once boys hit puberty and even before, that the kind of ease we have with each other and the intimacy that a lot of boys have just falls away.
Yeah.
Because of the stigma of intimacy among men and boys.
And even the stigma of feeling. We did a group of boys who were 4 and 5, and then
Mhm.
6 and 7, and the 4 and 5-year-olds were totally open. I feel this, I feel that, their words, they were playing. We did this thing like emotional green light, red light, where they had to kind of pay attention to their bodies and how uncomfortable or comfortable they felt, and they were totally in. And
Mhm.
then the 6, 7-year-olds, they were like, I don't want to talk about my feelings. You better not make me talk about my feelings. I'm not going to talk about my feelings, like, already. And
Mhm.
then when we'd ask, well, why? I don't want to be made fun of. I don't want to be made fun of for having feelings, for admitting I'm sad.
The cultural DNA is so deep that I don't care who you are as a parent. I don't care how empathetic you are as a man to your son. Those ideas are going to get fully um, engorged.
It's a good verb.
You can't escape the culture in which you live.
Right.
It's impossible. It's the water you swim in if you're a fish. So you can model and should model as a parent, but it's impossible to escape it entirely or even a little bit. I see it in my own son. I see it in I see it in every boy. I shouldn't even use my own son anecdotally. I mean, I see it in every kid. Every boy understands the language of masculinity by the time they're 3, 4, 5 years old, 6 years old. We all understand it because it's the lingua franca. It's the way we communicate as people. You learn it the same time or even before you're learning your native language. Like, you're just learning so much, and it happens through a kind of cultural osmosis. I don't know how it works, but it absolutely works. Every boy, you'll never meet a boy who doesn't understand these questions about intimacy and emotion. We all understand it. We usually don't talk about it or name it, but we all understand it.
Right.
We're fluent in it. We're fluent in that language.
Right. It's interesting because there's a woman I know who has another book coming out called Tomboy,
Mhm.
and she did a lot of research on gender and these girls who considered themselves tomboys, and she ended up kind of coming to a conclusion that children shouldn't be raised with any gender.
I totally agree with the notion that gender itself is almost meaningless. I
Right.
agree with that notion, but there's nothing wrong with self-identifying as the thing that you are or that you feel yourself to be. I mean, I feel so strongly male, like weirdly strongly. Like, it's such a fundamental, it is the fundamental element of who I am.
Right.
But I have also fundamentally felt throughout my whole life like I am not the same kind of male as I see so many other men being. But I never questioned my own maleness as a result of that.
That's incredible. How do you think, like, how do
Because
you
I
think you did that?
because it wasn't it it's like saying, I have 5 fingers. You know what I mean? It's like it's such a fundamental sense of my own identity. There I have, like I've always known I was straight. It's like a similar thing. But then there will be those kids who are like, but I don't feel like a boy and I don't feel like a girl. And in that gray area, which as a culture we're really sort of investigating right now, and I think is really interesting.
Yeah.
And I think as a sort of large, and I think as a culture, we're coming to understand that there is that gray area and that that's okay. That's actually a really interesting area because we can understand, I think now, as a larger culture, we're getting there, that there is an element of the population that doesn't fully identify as either male or female. And then there's the much larger population that does. So if we can then understand that in between this and this, there's all of this, that can be really helpful to all of our uh, reimagining of what gender is. I grew up sort of understanding, because I was fluent in the language of masculinity, that men are expected to be the pursuer in relationships, are expected to initiate like a first kiss. But I had real confusion around like what, like my understanding of how the whole process worked was you would like kiss a girl, and then, maybe she would resist a little, but then she'd be like, okay, like I really like kissing you. Like that was, and then like you were expected to like, if she was cool with kissing you, then you were expected to try to feel her up. And
Totally.
then
Second
she'd
base.
be like, no, you can't feel me up. But then you'd be like, well, I really want to feel you up. And she'd be like, okay, cool, you can feel me up. Like, and every step of that is so contrary to like the way we're trying to raise boys now.
Because if she said no,
And so,
you wouldn't kiss, and
right,
you wouldn't
exactly.
know her boobs, right? It would just be over.
Right. And so those ideas are really common in the culture right now. Like no means no, I think has really taken root for the better of society. But the idea that boys aren't also still meant to be the aggressor, that idea hasn't left us. Like that idea is still really entrenched in male culture. And so I think a lot of young,
I was going to say,
oh yeah, and with women too.
Women will say, does he have throwdown factor? And so to me, that's saying like, can he just take you? Can he throw you down? That's what I want. So it's very, a lot of women, I'm not saying all women, but a lot.
I've never heard that term, but it's explicit.
Like, now
I get it.
Right.
I get it.
Right.
Yeah, and it causes, I think it causes real confusion for young men. I mean, I know it does. What are we supposed to do and how are we supposed to do it? And you can be like my son, who I think is like really kind of wary and passive with women. But then there's also guys who take the throwdown approach. And that's obviously a lot scarier. But you can understand why some guys would feel like that's the appropriate thing to do. Obviously, all boys know it is not appropriate to sexually assault.
Right.
But what is sexual assault can get fuzzy, I think, for some guys.
Right.
Issues of consent, I don't think are as black and white as we want them to be.
One thing that Peggy Orenstein said that I really loved that she found that was different is that gay boys will say, hey, what are you into? What do you like? They're like used to having more of a conversation of, I like this. What do you like? Is that compatible? And I don't necessarily think straight boys do that.
No, never.
That'd be huge.
Huge. Like that's a conversation I would have trouble having with my wife now after 21 years.
Really? You're going to like walk out of the room and be like, what are you into?
I mean, I know at this point, but yeah, but yeah, like that's not a comfortable conversation for me.
Right. And I think if that changed too, that feeling of it being a conversation and it's okay to talk about it and it's an extension of this is who I am and this is what I like and this is how I feel and who are you and what do you like and how do you feel, then maybe some of those gray areas would be less.
Yeah, they would be. And
it wouldn't have to just be because she said no, right? Or she said yes. It'd be like, you really know.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I those conversations are necessary.
So if I were to think of like one last thing, what would you say would be like a really good first step? Like from your book and how you talk about things, like what would be, if you had a bullhorn and could kind of make boys of any age feel or look at something differently, what would you say?
I would say I'm operating from a place of a very simple premise, which is that traditionally masculine attributes, the kinds of attributes that often get labeled into the umbrella term toxic masculinity, do not need to be discarded in any way, shape, or form. the traditional masculine attributes of strength, independence, courage, fortitude, these are all really important, powerful, positive attributes for any human to have. But what I'd like to see start happening is to start incorporating those attributes with more traditionally feminine attributes. So when you think about love, for example, and how much bravery is required to love another human being, how much strength it requires to be honest, to see a relationship through. The fortitude that's needed, the courage that's needed to not only love, but to be loved, to allow yourself to have somebody else enter your psychic space. That's what I'm interested in right now.
Yes. And that to give boys in particular and men in particular the mission to use their masculine traits to love, to be bold and strong in love, doesn't make them weak. Makes them
strong. It makes them strong.
Right.
It makes them much stronger.
I love that. I think that's...
Oh, I'm terrific at this stuff.
You're amazing. I mean, for someone who has no education.
Being a literate sharecropper. You are.
You're so smart. I love it. I think it's so exciting you're doing this work.
Thanks.
And just thank you.
Oh, thank you for doing the work you're doing. It's great.
Thank you.
Good luck with the program. I think it sounds incredible.
Thank you so much. I'll keep you posted.
Bye.
Bye, Michael. Bye.